Real stories of werewolves, of Dogman from history, from your emails, illustrated and animated with the democratizing magic of machine learning AI. Welcome to Scary Stories.
Dogman versus the Creature. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I was a teenager the first time I saw the Dogman. I remember exactly how the air felt that day, thick enough to chew, heavy with the scent of decaying vegetation and something else I couldn't quite name. At the age of 14, I was all gangly limbs and boundless curiosity, convinced I knew the swamp behind our house better than anyone. My parents had always warned me not to venture too deep, but warnings like that only fuel a teenager's determination. The afternoon sun filtered through the cypress trees, casting dappled light across the murky water. Dragonflies skimmed across the surface, tiny iridescent helicopters on patrol. I had been following a series of unusual tracks, too large for raccoons, but too oddly shaped for deer, pushing further into the swamp than I'd ever gone before. The change came suddenly. One moment I was cataloging different mushroom species growing on a fallen log, and the next, the stillness descended that made my skin prickle. The cicadas stopped their incessant drone. The birds fell silent. Even the mosquitoes that had been feasting upon my exposed arms seemed to disappear. Something was watching me. I'd grown up around animals. I knew the feeling of a curious deer or a cautious fox observing from the underbrush. This was different, though. Heavier. More intentional. My heart beat pretty hard as I slowly turned, scanning the dense foliage surrounding the small clearing where I was standing. And that is when I saw it. Between two big old cypress trees partially obscured by hanging moss, stood a figure that shattered everything I thought I knew about the natural world. It was tall, easily 8 feet, with a distinctly canine head perched atop a body that stood upright like a human. Dense fur covered its muscular frame, dark gray along the back, and fading to tawny around what could only be described as a chest. Its front limbs hung too long, ending in what weren't quite hands, but definitely weren't paws either. I froze, unable to process what I was seeing. My brain kept trying to rearrange the image into something familiar. A bear standing upright, perhaps, or a man in some elaborate costume. But there was an ancient intelligence in those amber eyes that locked onto mine, a predatory awareness that no costume could hope to replicate. The creature's snout wrinkled, revealing teeth too long and sharp for comfort. A low rumble vibrated through the clearing, not quite a growl, deeper and more complex, like the sound of distant thunder trapped in a barrel. My paralysis ended, and I ran. Branches whipped my face as I crashed through the underbrush, splashing through shallow pools, vaulting over fallen logs. I didn't dare look back, although my ears strained for sounds of pursuit. The rational part of my brain insisted nothing that size could move quietly, and yet somehow I heard nothing except my own panicked breathing and the splash of my own footfalls. I burst from the tree line behind our house, sprinting across the yard and through the back door with such force that my mother dropped the plate she'd been drying. "What on earth?" she began, but stopped when she saw my face. "What happened?" My words tumbled out in a frantic jumble. Wolf. Man. Standing, watching, teeth. None of it making sense even to my own ears. My father, practical to his core, grabbed his rifle and went to check the property line, returning an hour later, having found nothing but my chaotic trail through the mud. He probably saw a black bear, he concluded, ruffling my hair with calloused fingers. They can look mighty strange when they stand up. But my younger sister Sarah sat wide-eyed at the kitchen table, absorbing every word of my scattered description. "I believe you," she whispered later that night, perched on the edge of my bed. "What do you think it was?" That question launched a quest that would consume the next 2 decades of my life. The next morning I rode my bike 8 miles to the county library, where I discovered terms like cryptid and wolfman for the first time. I read about similar sightings across the country: Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio, each account making my encounter seem less isolated and more real. My sister Sarah became my confidant and my research assistant, sneaking books past our parents who grew increasingly concerned about my unhealthy fixation. We created elaborate filing systems for sightings, behaviors, and habitats. When the internet arrived in our home years later, it opened floodgates to communities of others who had seen things that they also couldn't explain. I knew what I'd seen in those swamps, and 19 years later, I would learn that something even stranger had been lurking in those waters all along. That first year after the encounter transformed me in ways I couldn't have imagined. What began as desperate research to validate what I'd seen evolved into a full-blown obsession that would shape my identity. Sarah and I became a two-person cryptid investigation team, spending weekends huddled in the library's reference section while other kids played sports or hung out at the mall. I'll never forget the day I discovered a dusty tome about folklore of the American wilderness, tucked away on the bottom shelf. My hands trembled as I flipped to an illustration of a wolf-headed biped that matched what I'd seen. The caption read, "The Dogman, a persistent legend among lumber communities of the Midwest." I nearly shouted in the quiet library. Here was proof that I wasn't crazy. My bedroom walls gradually disappeared between pictures, newspaper clippings, and hand-drawn sketches. My mother worried. My dad got mad. "This isn't healthy," he'd say, shaking his head as he passed my door. But Sarah would sneak me new materials. Regional folklore books purchased with her allowance, printouts from earlier internet forums, where others shared similar encounters. School became secondary to my research. My grades suffered except in biology, where I peppered my bewildered teacher with questions about canid genetics and evolutionary anomalies. Most of my classmates pulled away, whispering "werewolf boy" when I passed in the hallway, but their mockery only hardened my resolve. At the age of 16, I saved enough for my grocery bagging job to buy a decent camera and night vision scope. Every full moon, I'd sneak out to the edge of the swamp, setting up crude monitoring stations. Sarah would cover for me, telling our parents I was at a friend's house studying. I never ventured as deep as that first time. Fear and respect kept me at the perimeter. But I'd sit motionless for hours, watching, waiting, hoping. Most nights yielded nothing beyond mosquito bites and damp clothing, but occasionally distant howls would echo across the water. Not quite wolf, not quite human, sending electric chills up and down my spine. Once I captured mysterious eyeshine on film, 2 amber orbs floating at a height impossible for any known local wildlife. The developed photo was frustratingly blurry, but it fueled me for months. By senior year, I had established connections with cryptozoologists and amateur researchers across the country. We exchanged theories and reports through letters and early email chains, creating a network of believers who understood what it was like to glimpse something that shouldn't exist. These strangers became sort of my tribe when local friends couldn't understand my passion. Sarah remained my staunchest ally, even while pursuing her own interests. "One day you'll prove it to everyone," she'd say during late-night strategy sessions in our shared backyard fort, and I'll be right there saying, "I told you so." I didn't realize how prophetic her words would become. College arrived like a fork in the road of my obsession. My parents insisted on practical education, something to fall back on when I outgrew this cryptid phase. I chose zoology, imagining it would legitimize my research. Reality proved more complicated. The structure of academic science felt suffocating after years of independent study. Professors dismissed cryptozoology as pseudoscience. My classmates snickered when I attempted to connect coursework to unexplained sightings. I learned to compartmentalize, keeping my academic self separate from my true passion. I still conducted field research during breaks, returning to the swamp with improved equipment and methodology. Each trip home I'd notice how the landscape was changing. New housing developments encroaching, water levels fluctuating with each season. The thought of the Dogman's habitat shrinking filled me with unexpected sadness. Sarah headed to art college in Chicago, her childhood interest in my research evolving into haunting paintings of liminal wilderness spaces that gained surprising traction in local galleries. "You are my inspiration," she told me over holiday dinners. "I paint what might be there in the shadows." After my graduation, practical concerns pulled me toward conventional employment. I took a position with the state's Environmental Protection Agency, close enough to my interests while providing stability. My colleagues knew me as thorough and dedicated and never suspected that I analyzed every unusual animal report with particular attention, or that I maintained extensive cryptid research files in my apartment. Relationships came and went, each ending when partners discovered the depth of my hobby. It's like sharing you with a ghost, my last girlfriend said while packing her things. I couldn't explain how something I'd seen for mere minutes had claimed so much of my life. The years slipped by in a rhythm of work, research, occasional swamp visits, and maintaining connections within the cryptid community. Online forums replaced library books, digital cameras replaced film. The tools evolved, but the quest remained the same. At 32, I moved back to my hometown after a promotion to regional supervisor. The return wasn't entirely professional. The swamp called to me, an itch that I could never fully scratch. Although I had investigated reports of similar creatures in 3 different states, nothing matched the intensity of my Dogman encounter when I was 14 years old. I bought a small house on the outskirts of town, close enough to the swamp for weekend expeditions, but respectable enough that neighbors saw only a government employee who enjoyed wildlife photography. My research room stayed locked when company visited. I had almost convinced myself the pattern would continue indefinitely, this double life of mundane days and obsessive nights. But then came my sister Sarah's phone call, her voice tight with excitement and fear, reopening a door I thought had closed 19 years earlier. The call came on a rain-soaked Tuesday evening, as I was cataloging recent Dogman sightings from northern Michigan. Sarah's name flashed across my phone screen, unusual for a weeknight when she normally taught late art classes. Her voice trembled when I picked up the phone, lacking its usual confidence. Something happened, she told me. She told me she saw something. The hairs on the back of my neck stood at attention. In 2 decades of sharing my obsession, Sarah had always been my believer, my supporter, but never a witness herself. Where are you? Are you safe? I grabbed my keys instinctively. I'm home now. I'm okay. I'm just a little shook up. She took a deep breath that crackled through the phone. I was at the old swamp, the place where you had your sighting. I've been doing a series of paintings, trying to capture the places that shaped us. My heart pounded in my chest. The swamp. The swamp again. I set up near that fallen cypress, she told me. You remember the one that looks like a sleeping giant? The light was perfect, all golden hour shadows across the water. And then, she told me, the water just moved wrong. I sat into my chair, knuckles white against the phone. At first I thought I was seeing an alligator, but it was huge. When it emerged, she paused. I could hear her struggling to translate the impossible into words. It walked on 2 legs, she told me, like a person, but not like a person at all. What did it look like? I asked. Long snout, she said. Green scales. It was greenish black in the sunset. Tall, maybe 6.5 feet. Its eyes weren't animal eyes. There was intelligence there. Calculation. It looked right at me. It tilted its head like it was curious. My research room suddenly felt too small, too confining. Years of collecting secondhand accounts hadn't prepared me for my own sister's direct experience, in the exact same location as my encounter. Did it approach you? I managed to ask, scenarios racing through my mind. No, it just watched me pack up my easel, which I did at record speed, let me tell you. A nervous laugh escaped her. Then it slipped back under the water. The strangest part was I wasn't terrified. I was scared, but I was also astonished. Like seeing a shooting star, I guess. I recognized the feeling, that mixture of fear and wonder that had fueled 19 years of searching. What did I see? She asked me. Her voice had regained some steadiness. Was this your Dogman? No, I said slowly, my mind racing through classification possibilities. But possibly the same category, you might say. There are reports of bipedal reptilians in southern swamplands. Most cryptozoologists dismiss them as misidentified alligators, but this wasn't a misidentified anything, she stated firmly. This was something unknown but real. Unknown. The word hung between us, charged with possibility. "I need to see this," I said finally, decision crystallizing. "I need to go back there." "I figured you'd say that. That's why I already packed your old camping gear from the garage." "When can you come down?" she asked. 3 days later, I requested emergency personal leave from work, threw my equipment into my truck, and began the journey back to where everything started. For the first time in years, the familiar thrum of excitement drowned out the whispers of doubt that had begun to creep in with age and disappointment. 2 cryptids, 1 location. This couldn't be coincidence. What if they were somehow connected? What if the swamp held more secrets than even my teenage self had imagined? The swamp feels different at dusk. That's something no scientific journal or cryptid forum can prepare you for. The way darkness transforms familiar terrain into something ancient and scary. I settled into my carefully chosen observation point, a natural blind formed by a fallen tupelo and overhanging moss, and I waited as the day creatures gave way to the creatures of night. 3 hours passed in meditative stillness. My muscles ached from the unnatural crouch, but years of field research had taught me patience. The quarter moon cast silver ribbons across the black water, enough light to see without completely sacrificing my night vision. Perfect conditions for what I come to think of as my reunion with the impossible. The splash came just after midnight, subtle enough that an untrained ear might have dismissed it as a fish jumping or a turtle slipping from a log. But there was a deliberateness to the sound that made my heart stutter. Something large was moving through the water, trying to move quietly, but hampered by its size. I raised my night vision binoculars with trembling hands, scanning the rippling surface approximately 30 yards away. A shape darker than the surrounding blackness broke the water, elongated, sleek, moving with purpose. The moonlight caught it momentarily, revealing the unmistakable contours of a reptilian snout, far larger than any animal native to these waters. The creature emerged with surprising grace, water cascading from its scaled body as it rose to a bipedal stance. Even in the dim light, I could make out the powerful muscles shifting beneath its hide, the way its tail swung in a perfect counterbalance to its movement. This was my sister's lizard man, exactly as she had described, standing upright at nearly 7 feet tall, with intelligent, calculating eyes that swept the shoreline in predatory assessment. I forced myself to breathe silently through my nose, fighting the instinct to flee. The creature moved along the marshy edge with purpose, occasionally dipping clawed hands into the water to retrieve something. Fishing, I realized with astonishment. Tool use. Deliberate hunting behavior. My scientific mind raced to categorize what I was seeing. Not quite crocodilian, something more evolved, more specialized. Maybe a living fossil, an evolutionary branch that had continued in secret while science remained oblivious to its existence. The thought had barely formed when a low rumbling growl cut through the night, different from any sound the lizard creature had made, emanating from the woods behind me. I knew that growl. I had heard it in my nightmares and my fondest dreams for 19 years. It was the Dogman, and it had returned. I froze completely, caught between the 2 apex predators, like a rabbit between wolves. With agonizing slowness, I shifted my gaze over my shoulder. There he stood, taller than I remembered, his gray-brown fur now showing streaks of silver around a muzzle that bore fresh scars. The lean, powerful body was poised in a half-crouch, amber eyes fixed not on me, but on the reptilian being by the water's edge. Those eyes held something I hadn't seen in my childhood encounter. Territorial fury. The lizard man's reaction was immediate, a defensive posture, its own growl bubbling up from a throat that seemed designed for underwater hunting, rather than land-based intimidation. The standoff lasted perhaps 10 seconds, each creature taking the other's measure across the moonlit clearing. When they moved, it was with explosive speed that defied their size. The Dogman launched forward in a bounding charge, while the lizard man pivoted with surprising agility, its powerful tail whipping around as a natural weapon. The impact when they collided sent vibrations through the ground beneath my hidden position. What followed was both beautiful and terrifying, a primordial ballet of tooth and claw, strength and strategy. The Dogman fought with the coordinated power of a land predator, using powerful forelimbs to grapple, while snapping with teeth designed to crush bone. The lizard man was surprisingly quick, its scaled hide deflecting some attacks while its claws sought vulnerable points. Water splashed as they crashed through the shallows, neither yielding ground willingly. Watching them, I understood why cryptids remained mythical. These weren't simple animals, but intelligent beings with fighting styles that suggest experience and adaptation. A particularly vicious swipe from the Dogman caused the reptilian creature to hiss, a sound so filled with hate it sent ice through my veins, before making a tactical retreat toward deeper water. The Dogman pursued, but halted at the water's edge, pacing with frustration, as its opponent submerged with barely a ripple, vanishing into the black depths. For several minutes, the canine cryptid patrolled the shoreline, its breathing heavy but controlled, muscles hunched beneath silver-streaked fur. Then, in a moment that will define the remainder of my life, it turned and looked directly at my hiding place. Our eyes met across 19 years of searching, and I saw recognition flicker in those amber depths. Not just recognition of a human, but of me specifically, the boy who had fled in terror, returned now as a man. It held my gaze for what felt like an eternity, and then deliberately turned away, disappearing into the forest with surprising silence for a creature of that size. I remained motionless long after both beings had vanished, my camera forgotten in my hands, tears streaming silently down my face. I hadn't just witnessed a territorial dispute between two unknown species. I'd been acknowledged by the creature that had shaped my entire existence.
If you want a person who's kind and caring, then look no further than our EP Sharon. Please join me in thanking channel member Sharon Smirnoff for making this episode possible. As a channel member, she gets to see our weekly secret uncensored episodes.
The mystery of the Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC. It started when I had to take the garbage out on Wednesday night. It felt like the garbage can sort of always mocked me each Wednesday. Heavy metallic sentinels standing guard at the edge of my driveway, collecting the week's discarded remnants. I had moved to this quiet suburban neighborhood 6 months ago, hoping for something resembling peace after years of city chaos. Streetlights cast weak amber pools across the asphalt, creating shadows that stretched like nervous fingers. My kitchen clock had just clicked past 11 when I realized I had forgotten to take out the trash. Again. I grabbed the black plastic bag, its contents containing crumpled takeout containers and yesterday's coffee grounds. The screen door creaked, always the same tired sound, as I stepped out onto the concrete walkway. Cool air brushed against my bare arms, carrying a strange stillness with it that felt wrong. At first I didn't see it. Then, movement caught my peripheral vision. Something shifted between my neighbor's hedges and the recycling bins. Not a raccoon. Not a stray dog. Something different. It stood impossibly tall, hunched yet massive, with a silhouette that defied natural anatomy. Fur, or was it matted hair, seemed to absorb what little light existed. Its proportions were very wrong, grotesquely wrong, human-like in structure but fundamentally not. Our eyes met, yellow, intelligent. Time stopped. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, a frantic drumroll of pure terror. Every muscle in my body screamed to run, but primitive fear had welded my feet to the ground. The creature didn't move. It simply watched. Then, a low sound emerged. Not quite a growl, not quite a breath. Something between a whisper and a rumble that seemed to bypass my ears and vibrate directly through my bones. My brain finally reconnected with my legs. I bolted. The screen door slammed behind me with such force that I was certain the frame would splinter. Breath ragged, hands shaking, I pressed my back against the interior wall. Sweat beaded across my forehead despite the evening's chill. Outside, absolute silence returned. No rustling, no movement, just darkness and those waiting garbage cans. I wouldn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every shadow seemed to hold potential for that impossible shape to re-emerge. My mind raced with questions. What was it? Where did it come from? And more terrifyingly, would it return? Little did I know then that this was just the beginning of something far more unsettling than a single unexplained encounter. The days following that night became an exercise in deliberate rationalization. I told myself it was a trick of light, an overactive imagination, a momentary hallucination brought on by stress and too many late nights at the accounting firm. My colleagues noticed something was off. Jake, who sits in the cubicle next to mine, kept asking if I was feeling all right. Dark circles had taken up permanent residence under my eyes, and my usual meticulously organized workspace now looked like a scattered collection of half-finished reports and crumpled coffee cups. I'm fine, I'd say, the words sounding hollow even to my own ears. My mother was the first to press harder. We spoke on a Sunday afternoon, her voice crackling through the phone line with a familiar mixture of concern and mild interrogation. "You sound exhausted, honey," she said. "Are you eating properly? Are you working too hard?" I couldn't tell her about the creature I'd seen. How could I explain something I'd barely understood myself? Instead, I deflected. "Just a rough patch at work," I mumbled, twirling the phone cord around my finger, an old habit that somehow grounded me. That night, the first strange light appeared. It wasn't dramatic, at least not at first. Just a pinprick of intensity against the night sky, bright enough to catch my attention as I stood by the kitchen window. Pale blue-white, utterly still, suspended just above the tree line behind my rental house. I blinked. It was still there. Rational mind racing, I considered explanations. Satellite? Drone? Unusual star? But something about its quality felt wrong. It felt like it was watching me. 3 nights later it happened again. This time the light moved. Not in any predictable pattern, no smooth trajectory like an aircraft. Instead it seemed to pulse, shifting position with jerky, almost mechanical precision. One moment centered, the next skipping several degrees to the left or right, without apparent transition. I started documenting everything. A leather-bound notebook became my companion. Detailed entries chronicled each occurrence. Date, time, duration, movement patterns. Hard data to counter the growing sense of unreality that was consuming my thoughts. My research took me down unexpected paths. Local forums, obscure websites dedicated to unexplained phenomena, cryptozoology message boards where people shared experiences that sounded both incredible and, to me, uncomfortably familiar. Most dismissed such accounts as fantasy, but some descriptions matched my experience with unsettling precision. Accounts of creature sightings in rural Wisconsin, unexplained aerial phenomena reported across Midwestern states, patterns that suggested something more than isolated incidents. Sleep became a battlefield. Every creak of the house, every rustle outside my window triggered an adrenaline response. I'd find myself sitting upright, heart racing, stomach churning, scanning darkness for any hint of movement. Exhaustion and paranoia began to blur together. The lights continued. Sometimes multiple points of illumination, sometimes a single persistent glow that seemed to study the landscape and me with calculated patience. I was being watched, and whatever was watching seemed to be getting closer. The human mind is a delicate mechanism. Push it too far, and the carefully constructed walls of rationality begin to crumple like wet paper. My work started to suffer first. Spreadsheets that once made perfect sense became landscapes of confusion. Numbers danced across my screen, refusing to align. My supervisor called me into her office, a crisp, clinical space that felt more like an interrogation room than a performance review. "Is everything all right?" she asked, her eyes scanning my recent reports. I wanted to tell her about the lights, about the impossible creature I'd seen. Instead, I mumbled something about stress and I promised to do better. I wasn't sleeping, at least not really. Each night became a marathon of vigilance. I positioned myself near windows, notebook in hand, watching, waiting. The world outside my rental seemed to pulse with a hidden rhythm, a secret language just beyond my comprehension. My apartment transformed. What was once a carefully organized space became a war room of investigation. Bulletin boards covered the walls, connected by a web of red string. Printouts from obscure websites. Local maps marked with precise locations of my encounters. Photographs taken at odd hours, capturing fragments of unexplained illumination. Friends stopped calling. Text messages went unanswered. My social circle shrank to a pinpoint of isolation. Jake from work approached me one afternoon, genuine concern etched across his face. "Hey," he said, "we're worried about you." I laughed. The sound surprised even me. Sharp and slightly unhinged. Researching became an obsession. I discovered a network of similar accounts. Whispered stories of creatures that didn't belong in our understanding of reality. Encounters documented in hushed tones, shared by people who understood the weight of being a witness. My sleep patterns disintegrated. I'd catch maybe 2 hours each night, interrupted by constant surveillance. Energy drinks and cold coffee became my sustenance. My body grew thin, muscles tensed like coiled wire. I started recording everything I could. Voice memos, handwritten journals, digital timestamps of each unusual occurrence. My phone filled with hundreds of photographs, most capturing nothing more than darkness, but each representing a moment of potential revelation. The lights continued their mysterious dance across the night skies, sometimes multiple points of illumination, sometimes a single persistent glow. Paranoia wasn't a choice. Paranoia was life. I installed additional security cameras, motion-activated lights. I reinforced locks on every entrance. My rental became a fortress, although against what I wasn't even sure. Colleagues began to whisper. I caught fragments of conversation, concerned glances, hushed discussions about my mental state, but they didn't understand. They couldn't comprehend the magnitude of what I was experiencing. My research revealed fragmented accounts of similar phenomena. Cryptozoology forums, paranormal investigation websites. Each story felt like a piece of a larger and more terrifying puzzle. My weight dropped. My suits hung loose. My belts cinched tighter with each passing week. Dark circles beneath my eyes transformed from temporary exhaustion to a permanent landscape of investigation and fear. I was becoming something else. A witness. A recorder. A keeper of impossible truths. The boundary between what I knew and what I suspected grew increasingly blurred. Reality felt malleable. A thin membrane ready to tear at any moment, revealing something profound and terrifying underneath. Something was coming, and I was the only one who seemed to recognize its approach. 2 weeks had transformed me into a shell of my former self. My world had narrowed to a single point of desperate anticipation. Waiting, watching, knowing something was returning. It happened on a Tuesday. Not the dramatic night I'd imagined, but a mundane evening that felt like any other. I had been monitoring my security cameras, the blue-white glow of multiple screens, casting strange shadows across my living room. Takeout containers littered the coffee table. Weeks of research, printouts, maps, fragmented notes, created a chaotic landscape around me. The motion-activated lights outside flickered. Once. Twice. I froze. Something was different about this moment. The air itself seemed to change, thickening, becoming viscous, with an impossible tension. My breathing stopped, ears straining against the silence. Then, Movement. Not on the cameras. Not in the carefully monitored zones I'd established, but outside somewhere, to the left of my garage, where the shadows gathered most densely. A shape emerged. Not human. Not animal. Something fundamentally wrong with its structure. Limbs that bent at impossible angles. A form that seemed to absorb surrounding darkness rather than reflect it. Taller than before, more deliberate in its movements. This wasn't just a chance encounter. This felt like an arrival. My body refused to move, muscles locked in pure primal terror. The creature stood completely still, observing my house with an intelligence that defied explanation. Its eyes, those impossible yellow orbs, seemed to penetrate walls, to see beyond physical barriers. Memories of my research crashed through my mind. Fragmented accounts, whispered stories, encounters documented in hushed tones by those who had witnessed something beyond comprehension. This was different from our first meeting. This felt like a deliberate communication. Seconds stretched into an eternity. The creature didn't approach, didn't make a sound, simply existed in a space that shouldn't accommodate its impossible anatomy. My hand, shaking uncontrollably, reached for my phone. Documentation had become my lifeline, proof that I wasn't losing my mind. No signal. The phone's screen remained dark, dead. A low frequency began to pulse. Not a sound exactly, more like a vibration that originated somewhere between my ears and the base of my skull. A communication that bypassed traditional sensory understanding. Messages, fragments, impressions. Not words, not language, but something more profound. A communication that suggested vast, incomprehensible intelligence. We are watching. You are observed. This is not your space. The revelation hit me with physical force. This wasn't a random encounter. This was intentional and planned. I was being studied. My rental, my carefully constructed sanctuary, suddenly felt microscopic, vulnerable. A glass box with transparent walls offering no protection. The creature remained motionless, but its presence expanded, filled every corner of my perception. Something would have to change. I couldn't live like this, constantly vigilant, always watching, trapped between what I knew and what I suspected. When the shape finally moved, it did so with grace, sliding between shadows like water. No sound, no disruption of surrounding environment, simply gone. But the impact remained. I knew with absolute certainty that my life had irrevocably changed. Whatever connection had been established would not simply disappear. This was only the beginning. Unless I left. Breaking my lease became the only logical solution. Leaving wasn't just about changing addresses. It was about survival. A calculated retreat from a reality that had fundamentally shattered my understanding of the world. The lease termination process became a surgical operation of precision and desperation. My landlord stared bewildered as I methodically explained my immediate need to vacate. His skeptical eyes tracked my trembling hands, the dark circles beneath my eyes speaking volumes about my recent experiences. Personal emergency, I stated, sliding the official termination document across his desk. Non-negotiable. Packing revealed how much my life had transformed. What once was a carefully organized living space now looked like an investigator's evidence room. Bulletin boards covered with interconnected photographs, notebooks filled with meticulous observations, surveillance equipment scattered across surfaces like archaeological artifacts documenting an impossible encounter. I retained only essential documents, research materials, photographs, anything that might provide future context to what I'd been experiencing. My colleagues at the accounting firm watched my rapid unraveling with a mixture of concern and uncomfortable distance. Jake, who had been my closest work friend, attempted intervention multiple times. "Are you okay?" he asked, Because you've changed. Changed. Such a simple word for such a profound transformation. Moving became an exercise in psychological reconstruction. I selected a new apartment in a densely populated urban area. Constant human activity. Minimal darkness. Maximum visibility. Protection through proximity and noise. The new space felt sterile. Intentionally bland. White walls. Minimal decorations. Nothing that could capture lingering energies from my previous encounters. My mother called repeatedly during the relocation process. Concern etched into every conversation. "Are you sure you're alright?" she'd ask, that maternal intuition sensing that something fundamental had shifted. I offered practiced reassurances, carefully constructed narratives that revealed very little. Protection wasn't just physical. It was about maintaining psychological boundaries, too. Nights remained challenging. Sleep became a battlefield between exhaustion and vigilance. Every sound, every shadow, potential harbingers of return. Witnesses carry burdens others cannot comprehend. My encounters transformed from terrifying experiences into something more nuanced. A profound understanding that reality contains infinitely more complexity than human perception allows. Documentation became my lifeline, not to prove anything, not to convince anyone, besides me. Simply to maintain a record, evidence that something extraordinary existed beyond conventional understanding. I returned to my professional life and it continued. Accounting provided structure. Mathematical precision offered a counterbalance to the fundamental uncertainty I now carried with me. But underneath, always underneath, the recognition remained that I was now different, changed at a cellular level by an encounter that defied explanation. That impossible creature, those impossible lights, they weren't random occurrences, they represented something fundamental. A reminder that our perceived reality represents merely a thin membrane covering vast, incomprehensible dimensions. I would remain vigilant, always watching, always documenting. Some truths exist beyond traditional explanation, beyond scientific method, beyond comfortable human perception. And I have now become their keeper. We're moving and grooving like nothing's wrong because we got a donation from John Carnagon. Please join me in thanking channel member John Carnagon for making this episode possible. He donated to us using our Super Thanks button located under every one of our videos on YouTube. As a channel member, John Carnagon gets to see our weekly secret uncensored episodes like the 2 we have coming out this week, including I Fed My Cheating Husband to the Dogman. Werewolf. Fighting Alien. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I'm going to tell you about the one time I saw a Dogman back in the early 1970s. It happened in the woods behind my cousin's backyard in Michigan. The night air froze in my lungs as I watched them circle each other in the moonlit clearing. 2 impossible creatures, legends brought to terrible life beneath the pine trees. On my left stood what I could only describe as a Dogman, 7 feet of coiled muscle, topped with a wolf's head, but standing upright like a man. Its amber eyes blazed with primal fury, catching moonlight like burning coals. Each breath it took emerged as a rumbling growl that vibrated through the forest floor and into my bones. Facing it was something science fiction writers couldn't have even dreamed up. A humanoid figure with sleek black skin that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. Where its head should have been, a transparent dome glowed with an ethereal blue light, revealing 2 pinpoints inside that might have been eyes. Its movements were too weird to be anything from Earth. My cousin Jimmy grabbed my arm, his fingers digging in so tight that I'd find bruises the next morning. Neither of us breathed as the Dogman lunged forward with impossible speed, massive claws extended. The alien creature dodged with mechanical precision, its movements betraying no fear, no hesitation, just cold calculation. Pine needles crunched beneath my pro-kids as I shifted my weight, and Jimmy yanked me down harder behind the fallen oak that concealed us. The Dogman's ear turned slightly in our direction. For one terrible moment, I was certain it had hurt us. That moment stretched into eternity as my 13-year-old mind grappled with what my eyes were witnessing. Two creatures that shouldn't exist, couldn't exist, locked in combat just 30 feet away from where we hid. I'd go on to spend 47 years trying to convince myself it was all my imagination, a child's mind transformed by late-night monster movies and sugary soda. But whenever I close my eyes, I can still feel the night air against my face. I can still smell pine sap and something else, something metallic and foreign. And I know what I saw was real. But I should start from the beginning. It was the summer of 1973 when bell-bottoms were still cool and Star Trek reruns fueled our cosmic dreams. I was spending the weekend with my cousin Jimmy in a sleepy Michigan suburb where the houses were bigger than in my neighborhood and backed up against miles of pristine woodland. Jimmy's family had everything mine didn't: a color TV, air conditioning, and most importantly, freedom. My Aunt Lisa and my Uncle Dale believed in free-range parenting decades before it became a term. Kids need space to become themselves, Uncle Dale would say, tousling Jimmy's hair, while my own father would have been checking my homework for the third time. Their split-level ranch sat at the very edge of the development, with nothing between their manicured backyard and the dense forest, except a weathered picnic table where we'd eat popsicles and trade baseball cards. Jimmy's bedroom window faced those woods, and he'd filled notebooks with observations of deer, foxes, and once, though nobody believed him, a black bear. "This is Command Central," Jimmy announced that Saturday evening, proudly showing off his new telescope positioned by the window. A stack of UFO magazines sat on his dresser, beside a dog-eared copy of Chariots of the Gods by Eric von Däniken. His walls were plastered with posters, the Apollo missions, Star Trek characters, and grainy photos of supposed flying saucers. "Dad says it's all just baloney," Jimmy whispered conspiratorially, but Mom thinks there might be something to it. She once saw something weird over Lake Michigan when she was our age. We spent the afternoon building model rockets and planning our futures as astronauts before dinner, which was homemade pizza and root beer floats, a combination my mother would never have allowed at home. As twilight settled, Uncle Dale announced it was time for Chiller Theater, the Saturday night monster movie showcase. "You boys don't stay up late," Aunt Lisa cautioned as she headed upstairs with a paperback novel. "And Dale, don't let them watch anything too scary." Uncle Dale winked at us. "It's just the classics, honey, nothing they can't handle." That night's feature was Invasion of the Saucermen, little green aliens with bulbous heads terrorizing teenagers. Uncle Dale fell asleep 20 minutes in, his soft snores providing background music, as Jimmy and I whispered excitedly about what we would do if aliens chose that night to land. "I'd want to make friends with them," I insisted, "like in the day the Earth stood still." "No way," Jimmy countered. "They'd probably dissect you. I would hide and take pictures, and then I'd become famous." We were still debating alien intentions when the first strange light flashed across Jimmy's bedroom window, momentarily turning the ceiling an electric blue. Then another. And another. "Did you see that?" Jimmy whispered, scrambling toward his telescope. And just like that, our hypothetical scenario became terrifyingly real. Uncle Dale's snores grew louder as the credits rolled on Invasion of the Saucermen, the flickering TV casting dancing shadows across the room. Jimmy nudged me with his elbow, his face animated with the particular mischief that only 13-year-old boys can muster. "Come on, let's raid the kitchen before bed." That was the beauty of staying at Jimmy's house. Midnight snacks weren't contraband, but practically encouraged. At home, my mother would have lectured me about ruining my teeth or spoiling my breakfast, but here in the woods in Michigan, the rules bent like willow branches. We tiptoed past Uncle Dale, his newspaper falling across his chest, rising and falling with each breath. The kitchen was a wonderland of forbidden delights. Hostess cupcakes, Coca-Cola, and Jimmy's secret weapon, a family-sized bag of Doritos hidden behind the cereal boxes. "Mom thinks she's so clever," Jimmy snickered, retrieving his treasure. "She hides them in a new spot each week." Arms loaded with our contraband, we ascended to Jimmy's bedroom sanctuary, closing the door with practiced quietness. His room was a museum of boyhood obsessions. Model planes dangling from a fishing line attached to the ceiling, a collection of polished rocks on the windowsill, and His prized possession, a dog-eared star chart with his own handwritten notes in the margins. Mr. Wilkins says I could be an astronomer someday, he said, mouth already full of chips. I've logged 17 unidentified aerial phenomena since Christmas alone. I rolled my eyes. You mean you've seen 17 airplanes and pretended they were flying saucers? You're such a skeptic, Jimmy said, but not unkindly. That's why scientists work in teams, you know. I need someone to challenge my theories. We sprawled across his bedroom floor, trading fantastical theories about alien civilizations. Would they be peaceful explorers, or would they be invasion forces? Would they have technology that could cure diseases, or would they have weapons that could level cities? The sugar from the cupcakes fueled our imagination, sending it into hyperdrive as the digital clock on Jimmy's nightstand silently ticked past midnight. What would you do if aliens landed right here, like right in the backyard, I asked, my voice dropping to a theatrical whisper. Jimmy didn't hesitate. I'd make first contact. I'd become the ambassador between worlds. What about you? I'd probably just freeze, I admitted. Or maybe faint. We dissolved into laughter, unaware that the universe was about to call our bluff. The laughter died in my throat as a brilliant blue light washed through Jimmy's bedroom, so bright it momentarily turned midnight to noon. For one disorienting second, I thought Aunt Lisa had flipped on the overhead light to scold us for staying up too late. But the light vanished as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving us blinking in its afterglow. What was that? I asked. But Jimmy was already scrambling toward the window, nearly upending his telescope in his haste. You saw it, didn't you? Another flash illuminated the backyard, this time lingering long enough for me to see it wasn't coming from the house or the street, but from somewhere deeper into the woods. It pulsed with an otherworldly rhythm. 3 quick bursts, followed by one prolonged glow that seemed to seep between the pine trees like blue syrup. My heart hammered against my ribs as I joined Jimmy at the window. The logical part of my brain, the part that sounded suspiciously like my father, offered reasonable explanations. Car headlights on a distant road, teenagers with flashlights, perhaps even heat lightning from a storm brewing beyond the horizon. But when I pressed my face against the cool glass, what I saw defied all rational explanation. Hovering above the tree line was a disc-shaped object, rimmed with lights that shifted from electric blue to emerald green. It moved with deliberate slowness, as if surveying the landscape below, occasionally emitting those brilliant flashes that we'd seen earlier. Holy smokes, Jimmy said. That's not military. That's not anything from Earth. I wanted to disagree with him, to find the flaw in his logic, but my voice had abandoned me. The object rotated slightly, revealing its full silhouette against the star-studded sky. A perfect disc with a domed center, just like in Jimmy's magazines. We have to get closer to it, Jimmy declared, already putting on his sneakers. Are you crazy? I finally found my voice. We should wake up your dad. Jimmy shook his head vigorously. Adults never believe this stuff. Remember when Mr. Peterson reported lights over the lake? Everyone laughed at him for weeks. He thrust my sneakers toward me. Besides, we've been watching a science fiction movie tonight. They're just gonna blame the TV. This is our chance, man. Our one chance to see something incredible. As the strange craft descended lower into the forest, my curiosity wrestled with my fear, and it won. I slipped on my sneakers too, heart pounding like a drum in my chest. How do we get out without waking them? I whispered. Jimmy grinned, already sliding open his window. Trust me, man, I've done this before. Jimmy's practiced hand slid the window screen out of its frame with barely a whisper. He'd clearly done it before, despite his parents' seemingly relaxed rules. The cool night air rushed in, carrying the scent of pine and something else. Something metallic and foreign that made the hair on my arms stand on end. The trick, Jimmy whispered, is to land on the roof of the garage first, then shimmy down the drain pipe. I stared at him in disbelief. In any other circumstances, I would have backed out immediately. I was an honor roll student and a rule follower extraordinaire. My mother often boasted to relatives about how she never had to worry about me getting into trouble. And yet here I was, about to become an accomplice in what felt like the beginning of every alien abduction story ever told. We'll be quick, Jimmy promised, sensing my hesitation. We'll just take a peek and then we'll run back before anyone knows we're even gone. The blue light pulsed again through the trees, calling to us like a beacon. Whatever fear I harbored was smothered by something more powerful. Curiosity that burned through my veins like wildfire. I nodded, and just like that, I was transformed from rule follower to explorer. The garage roof greeted my sneakers with a soft thud, thankfully muffled by a thick layer of pine needles. Jimmy moved with the confidence of a cat, leading us down the drain pipe and across the dew-dampened lawn. Each step toward the woods felt like crossing an invisible boundary between the world I knew and something altogether different. As we reached the tree line, I glanced back at the house, so warm and safe with its warm yellow windows and chimney. For a fleeting moment, I considered turning back, but instead, I ran after Jimmy into the darkness. The forest in the darkness of night was nothing like the friendly woodland of daytime explorations. Shadows took on menacing shapes, and familiar paths twisted into labyrinths. Without the soft blue glow emanating from deeper within the trees, we would have been hopelessly lost within minutes. "This way," Jimmy whispered, his voice tight with excitement. We pushed through thickets of underbrush, brambles tugging at our pajama pants. The temperature seemed to drop with each step, until our breath clouded before us like spectral messengers. Normally teeming with life, the forest had fallen eerily silent. No crickets chirping, no owls hooting, as if every living creature was holding its breath alongside us. "Did you hear that?" I froze, gripping Jimmy's sleeve. A twig had snapped somewhere to our left, too heavy to be a squirrel or a raccoon. We both turned, looking through the darkness to see nothing. "Probably just a deer," Jimmy said, but his voice lacked conviction. The strange blue light pulsed again, closer now, drawing us deeper into the woods like moths to a flame. As we crested a small ridge, the trees began to thin, revealing a clearing ahead. Jimmy dropped to his knees, pulling me down beside him. "Look," he breathed, pointing through a gap in the underbrush. There was no UFO, but there was something there that was completely unforgettable. My first thought was how quiet it had become, just an absolute silence that pressed against my eardrums like physical weight. I asked my cousin Jimmy, "What's that?" In the center of the clearing stood what I at first mistook for a man in some kind of a diving suit, but as my eyes adjusted, I realized with gut-wrenching certainty that nothing human stood before us. Its body was sleek and obsidian, seeming to absorb the moonlight rather than reflect it. Where its head should have been was the dome, the transparent, glowing inner blue light dome that pulsed in hypnotic rhythm. It was the same color that the UFO had been, but now it was on a two-legged creature that stood upright like a man. Through the dome I could make out what might have been eyes, pinpricks of amber luminescence that scanned the forest methodically. Neither of us spoke as the creature, the robot, the alien, whatever it was, moved with fluid precision across the clearing, stopping occasionally to examine something on the ground, or to touch a tree trunk with its elongated fingers. "It's collecting samples," Jimmy breathed, his scientific mind working even through his fear. Like in National Geographic, when they study new environments. I wanted to run. Everything inside me told me to run back to the house, but my muscles had turned to stone, refusing any command to flee. The creature, or whatever it was, knelt, its jointed limbs bending in ways that reminded me of a praying mantis. From somewhere within its sleek form, it produced a device that emitted a soft humming sound. The air around it seemed to shimmer like heat waves off summer asphalt. And then, the forest erupted. Something massive burst from the tree line opposite our hiding place, a blur of muscle and fur and rage that moved faster than my eyes could track. The creature with the dome head barely had time to rise before 7 feet of nightmare slammed into it with bone-crushing force. A werewolf. That was my first wild thought. But no, its proportions were wrong, its movements too deliberate. This was something ancient, something that had stalked Michigan's forests since long before Europeans arrived with their silver bullets and full moon legends. This was the Dogman of campfire stories. It stood terrifyingly real before us, amber eyes blazing with primal fury as it circled the fallen alien robot. The mechanical man regained its footing with surprising grace, seemingly undamaged by the brutal attack. They faced each other in the moonlight, nature's perfect predator against something from beyond the stars, neither yielding ground, in a standoff that defied reality. When they clashed again, it was with calculated violence. The Dogman's claws raked against the alien's obsidian skin, creating sparks like flint on steel. The robot countered with inhuman speed, its movements fluid yet precise, landing blows that would have shattered oak. Jimmy's fingers dug deeper into my arm as we watched in horrified fascination. The battle seemed to bend time itself. Maybe it lasted minutes. Maybe it lasted hours. All I knew was that with each passing moment, the Dogman's attacks grew more ferocious, more desperate, while the alien's movements remained coldly efficient. Until something changed. The dome atop the alien flickered, its blue glow faltering momentarily. The Dogman, sensing weakness, lunged with renewed savagery, forcing the alien to retreat. One step, then another, toward the opposite side of the clearing. "It's winning," Jimmy whispered, disbelief coloring his voice. I nodded, unable to tear my eyes away from the impossible battle unfolding before us. The Dogman pressed its advantage, herding the alien toward the darkness beyond the moonlit clearing, until both disappeared into the shadows of the ancient forest. The silence that followed felt louder than any sound I had ever heard. For endless seconds, Jimmy and I remained frozen behind our fallen log, afraid that the slightest movement might draw the attention of whatever that was that had vanished into the darkness. The clearing stood empty now, bathed in innocent moonlight, as though nothing extraordinary had happened there. "We should go," I finally whispered, my voice strange and distant to my own ears. Jimmy nodded, but neither of us moved. Our spell was broken only when a distant voice carried through the trees, Uncle Dale calling our names, his tone edged with worry. This snapped us back to reality. We scrambled to our feet, legs tingling with pins and needles, and began our frantic retreat through the midnight forest. Each shadow concealed potential horrors. Every rustling branch became a reaching claw. We ran as only children can run when monsters are on their heels, with desperate, heedless speed. We were nearly at the tree line marking Jimmy's backyard when the humming started, a deep, resonant vibration that seemed to emanate from everywhere at once. The sound crawled up through the soles of my sneakers, rattling my teeth, and settled somewhere behind my eyes. "Look," Jimmy gasped, pointing skyward. Above us, barely visible through the pine boughs, a disc-shaped craft rose with impossible grace. Blue-green lights pulsed along its rim as it ascended, spinning slowly. For one breathtaking moment, it hovered directly overhead, close enough that I could see patterns etched into its metallic skin, symbols that resembled no alphabet I'd ever seen. And then, without warning, it shot straight up into the night sky, leaving nothing but a fading streak of light and the lingering scent of ozone. Uncle Dale found us a moment later, standing frozen at the edge of the woods, our faces upturned to an empty sky. "What in the world are you two doing out here in your pajamas?" he demanded, relief and anger warring in his voice. Jimmy and I exchanged a glance, loaded with unspoken agreement. No one was going to believe us, so we shouldn't tell anyone. "We thought we saw a meteor," Jimmy offered, his talent for quick fibs saving us. That summer night in 1973 changed something fundamental inside me. It opened a door that could never fully close again. Jimmy and I made a pact never to speak of what we'd witnessed, not even to each other. But on clear nights when stars pierce the darkness like distant lighthouses, I still find myself scanning the sky, wondering about that alien visitor and its woodland adversary. Some nights I swear I hear timber wolves howling deeper and more resonant than they should, and I wonder if something ancient still guards our forests against visitors from beyond. When the wind whispers through pine needles, sometimes I imagine it carries warnings. Stay away. This wilderness guarded by the teeth and claws of the North American Dogman.
Tonight's EP is John Carnagon, His generosity goes on and on. Please join me in thanking channel member John Carnagon for making this episode possible. As a channel member, not only here on YouTube, but also a PayPal channel member through peterbernard.com, John gets to see our secret, uncensored episodes. For more information about how you can help this channel stay online, like the heroic and eternal John Carnagon, here's our international TV spokesmongrel, Henry Lee Dogman. Hank?
Thanks, Biggie. And thanks to all of you for watching this far. If you liked it, please click like. If you'd like to see more of our work, please subscribe. And also click that bell icon if you'd like to be notified when we put out a new episode. To become an executive producer, you can donate to us through the thanks button under each of our videos or through our paypal.me/peterbernard209 page. To receive cool perks like secret uncensored Dogman episodes far too wild to ever run on this channel, you can become a YouTube channel member by clicking the join button or join our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com. Joining either at the $3 a month level or above gets you access to our over 25 hours of secret uncensored Dogman stories available nowhere else. Do you have a scary story about Dogman or some other kind of high strangeness that happened to you? Let us know by emailing us at scarystoriesnyc@gmail.com or by leaving us a voicemail message at 804-LA-SCARY. You may need to call back on that when it cuts off after I think 3 minutes. And if you don't want to do any of that stuff, thank you for simply watching to the end. Good night, and have a scary tomorrow.
Come back for more scary stories.